It's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Andy Kerr, Executive Director of the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, to address us. Dr. Andy Kerr obtained a doctorate at this university in climate change, examining the stability of the Antarctic ice sheet to climate change. He has worked in the private sector in the emerging international carbon and biofuel markets area. He has been involved in the creation of public policy, focusing on developing effective national and international and regional policy frameworks, supporting the reduction in our dependence on fossil fuels and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. He has recently been involved in projects including the Royal Society of Edinburgh's inquiry facing up to climate change, breaking the barriers to a low-carbon Scotland, and has advised the Scottish Government in relation to its climate change plan. He is a co-author of a book, Climate Change and Emissions Trading, which has just been published in its 3rd edition. So this is a highly topical and highly important area of interest to all of us. So with that introduction, I will ask Dr. Kerr to tell you more about his work and perhaps more about this building. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk over here and speak from over here because I've got a few slides. First of all, can I offer also my very warm welcome to you to this building. It is a fabulous place to work. And we're very fortunate to have it. I'll talk a little bit more about it during later on in my talk. But if anybody does want to have a look around afterwards, I'm very happy to show them and tell them some of the fascinating stories and historical stories behind the buildings. What I want to do today, I'm going to give you a very short story about innovation, because what I want to talk to you about is innovation and impact. And so I'm going to give you a little short apocryphal story about innovation. I'm then going to talk a little bit about energy and global energy trends, because this is one of the great challenges we have around the world at the moment. I'm then going to ask the question, what should the university be doing about this? How should the university best tackle, support, frame some of these problems? And then I'll explain what we're trying to do within ECCI, within the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. But just to get you thinking about innovation, let me start with a short apocryphal tale. For those with a good memory, 50 years ago, last Thursday, was the first day a human being walked in space, outside a spacecraft in orbit. I think his name was Ed White, but it was a milestone. It was part of basically the space race, which was this desire to put a human being on the moon. And the characterization of the space race was very much both political ambition, it was very much absolute cutting-edge science and technology, and indeed quite a lot of individual bravery as well. And through this process, one of the defining features was an attempt to try and capture all the bases. In other words, to make sure that they had checked and tried to undertake and risk manage every aspect of that whole science program and the space program. And one of the things that came up was, how do you write with pens in space? Because pens need gravity, to drive the ink down to write. So the question was, how do you write with pens in space? Now, in this little apocryphal tale, NASA spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to work out how you write with pens in space. And they were really struggling. And a couple of years in, there was a meeting with the Russians, and of course there was great competition with the Russians at the time. And an American sort of leaned across to one of the Russians and said, well, have you solved the space pen problem? And the Russian sort of said, and sort of sniggered a bit and said, oh, of course we've solved the problem of pens in space. And the American sort of leaned across and said, well, how did you achieve it? And the Russian leaned across and said, we use pencils. Now, it's not entirely true story, but the beauty of that story is that innovation is about making things work. It's about making things actually happen. And there is a tendency, and we all do it, we like elegant solutions. We like things that are beautifully made and beautifully elegant, that deliver outcomes. But often in reality, things are messy. Things are just the question is what works in practice at the time, and that's the thing that we need to be focusing on. And I just want you to keep that in mind when we talk about some of these issues with energy. Because if we look at energy and some of the great energy challenges, then energy is one of the great, if you like, challenges for the 21st century. Having accessible, cheap, readily available energy is an absolutely critical issue for any modern society. You cannot run a modern society without it. And so governments tend to get involved in these, and governments, anybody who's been involved in governments around energy will appreciate what they call the trilemma. Yeah? And these are generally mutually exclusive. You cannot have all three very easily, typically. Energy security, in other words, can you keep the lights on? Can you ensure that there's always readily available energy when we need it? Sustainability, whether it's air pollution in cities in Asia or Latin America, or it's greenhouse gas emissions, how do we try and decarbonize? How do we try and reduce the external impacts that using our energy actually has? And the third one around equity or affordability. Can we keep the price down? And typically, certainly in places like the UK, we've tended to try and match this, and we've been able to do two of the three, but it's very difficult to deliver all three. And if you look globally, you also tend to find two other things that come up. One around just energy access and one around economic growth. The access one is because over 1 billion people still do not have access to electricity today, out of a population of a bit over 7 billion. 2.6 billion people still cook with dirty fuels, in other words, that will have a direct impact on their health. So actually just having clean, accessible energy is still a challenge for nearly 1/3 of the population of the world today. But economic growth, energy is a huge infrastructure and is a huge business. So actually just in terms of reshaping energy means a great deal around economic growth. So within the UK, we import fossil fuels to the tune of about 50 billion pounds last year. So the drop in the oil price has a direct impact on economic growth within the UK and Europe and elsewhere. So these are the sort of issues that governments think about when they come to energy. And yet what we've seen in certainly the main three of the trilemma is radical simultaneous changes going on around the world in all three at the moment. It's a very, very turbulent time for energy and energy systems. So let me just talk through two or three of these. And I'm going to touch, first of all, on energy security. You won't be able to see the detail on these graphs. Don't worry about that. I'm going to start up here. All you need to look at, hoping I can get the line, is this black line. So this is the demand for LNG, liquefied natural gas. Gas has typically been a regional market. Yeah, you supply it locally, so prices vary dramatically around the world. What we've seen is an explosion of growth of the supply of LNG around the world, huge terminals being built in Asia, in Europe, to allow us to move gas around the world. What that has done is start to create a global commodity in gas, which has changed the whole notion about energy security. At the same time, you've seen huge growth in the US around shale gas, extraordinary technical innovations going on there, which allow us to take gas out of really quite difficult rocks that gas exists in, shale rocks. And we're seeing a massive growth in shale oil and shale gas. And at the same time, you're seeing, this is the global crude oil price, the Brent price, which then was dribbling along at 100 and then dropped to around 50 to 60 last year. So you're seeing major changes, structural changes in the markets. Now this last one is because the Saudis are pumping like mad at the same time as the US are not importing as much as they needed. There's lots of oil around in the market. But it's also worth thinking about the prices here. When I first started in, if you like, government policy making around energy back in the late 1990s, a paper was written called Energy Paper 68. And it was written by the government analysts in London, in the UK, but it drew on the best industrial expertise at the time. And it was trying to forecast greenhouse gas emissions, energy prices out for 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. And of course, to do that, they had to sort of guesstimate what the high and the low prices would be for different commodities. So for oil, they set the low price at being $10 a barrel. What do you think they set the high price as being? 1999, for 20 years. They looked at 20 years and said, what is the possible highest price oil could get to? 60? No, it was 20. And then they had a high price, which was, we can't possibly believe it would be any higher than that. Yeah? That was 30. So in other words, what does that tell us? It tells us we're useless at forecasting energy prices. Okay? So we shouldn't try. But it does matter, because what we're seeing is global structural shifts around energy markets. And at the same time, we're seeing massive investments going into renewables around the world. So this is renewable electricity investments. The red is the Asia Pacific, so China and East Asia in particular. The blue is North America, and the green is Europe. And Europe basically drove this through until in the first years of this century. Yeah. But since then, China and East Asia have taken over. So they're by far the biggest investor in renewables. So China is the single biggest investor country in renewables. The US is second. And it's worth saying that what this means is amazing capacity changes. China are putting on more renewables in any one year than are on the entire UK grid. Yeah. They have more wind capacity at 115 odd gigawatts than our entire grid. It is huge changes taking place in different parts of the world. And what we're seeing is this capacity growth. So these are guesses as to what the industry would do. So this grey one was an estimate from the International Energy Agency in the year 2000. The green and blue are in 2006. And actually the actual is red, that's what we're doing. So it's actually at the top end of any expectation for installed wind capacity. For solar, the expectation was that it would grow at this sort of rate, yeah? And what we've seen is this exponential growth of solar. And part of that is because and again, don't worry about the detail, what we've seen is radical price drops within solar. So the price of a solar panel has dropped by 80% in the last 5 years. So increasingly we're seeing renewables which are cost competitive directly with coal or gas. Certainly more cost competitive, in other words, they're cheaper than using diesel for electricity generation. Now, I'm always slightly wary about talking about cost competitive because you're always talking about apples and oranges. Something that is high capital cost and no running costs, which is intermittent like solar or wind, isn't the same as having fixed dispatchable generation like a gas plant. But we are getting to the point where the prices are getting very, very similar. And what we're seeing around the world are renewable investments now overtaking fossil fuel investments. So this is fossil fuel investments around the world. The last year, 2013, was $141 billion invested in fossil fuels. 2013 was the first year that renewables overtook fossil fuel investments, $143 billion. The current expected build rate over 2015, 20, 25, 2030 is like that, and the fossil fuel build rate is going down like that. We are seeing a complete restructuring of the energy supply around the world at the moment. And what we're expecting off the back of that, and these are just, again, this is the world, OECD, non-OECD. All I'm trying to show here, again, don't worry about the detail, is this pullback of coal, of oil, of gas, and increasingly more renewables, nuclear, and so on taking over. So again, you're seeing this restructuring taking place around the world. The other thing that's taking place, in particular in Latin America, in Asia, are issues around local air pollution. And I'll buy anybody a drink who can actually name these 5 great world cities that I'm going to show you now. Okay? 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 Okay. Come and talk to me afterwards, I'll tell you which ones they are. This is driving a lot of political activity. And the cause of this is partly coal burn close to cities, but mostly it's to do with vehicles burning diesel or petrol. So we are starting to see, again, cities starting to take really quite radical action to try and reduce air pollution, in order to avoid. So the question then is, how does a city improve its mobility to allow people to move within and between cities without ending up with this type of environment? And what we're seeing is increasingly what's been termed intelligent mobility. We're talking about a lot of different approaches to how we manage energy, how we manage waste within cities, how we manage water, and in particular around transport systems to try and make transport systems more effective but also less polluting. So these are the sorts of things that are driving a huge amount of change around the world. So what should the university be doing to face this? Now, from my perspective, the university, we've already heard, it's a top-ranking research university. We would expect it to be doing good research. We would expect it to be doing good teaching. But the question is, what more can it do? Should it do? And I would argue, actually, that Edinburgh, with its extraordinary reach of its current students, and again, I was out in Hong Kong with a university group because we're opening up offices out there, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And I was hearing comments like there are more Chinese students in Edinburgh than in Oxford and Cambridge combined. There are more in Edinburgh than the entire Ivy League combined. It's one, I'm not sure whether it's the biggest or one of the biggest recipients of American students in the UK. We have an extraordinary reach for students. So if we have this reach with alumni, we have hugely talented researchers and we have hugely talented teachers, what should we be doing more? And I would draw your attention, again, don't worry about the detail, to the strategic goals of the university, because we've got excellence in education, we've got excellence in research, and we've got excellence in innovation. And that's the one that interests me more than anything else. So again, given that you're alumni of the university, can you tell me what are the targets, 2012 to 2016 strategic plan for the university on innovation? Anybody know? Or even the key performance indicators, the KPIs. Anybody know what they are?
It's only about small companies. Number of companies formed per year.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're talking about, these are the objectives that have been set. So stimulate innovation, seek out novel applications, identify the best means of turning ideas into commercial reality, consolidate reputation as a partner of choice for commercialization, and so on and so forth. A lot of them are about commercializing, and we are very, very good as a university at spinning out ideas, licenses, IP, and companies. We're very good at that. But actually what the KPIs are is largely around number of disclosures, patents, new company formations. That's the key performance indicators. And our targets is basically adding economic impact and public policy. But I would challenge the university here, because I think the university can do more than that. If we want to be a top 10 global university, and I think we do, and we certainly have the talent to do that, then actually it's not about just pushing stuff out into society. It should be also about shaping some of these conversations. It should be actually about directing how we can take a positive approach around the world. So for me, excellence in innovation needs to be more than simply can we spin out companies. It should be about how can we actually drive conversations with public policy, with cultural change, with social change, within our local city, within Edinburgh, within the UK, within Scotland, and globally. That's where we should be aiming. We should be aiming very, very high. And to do that, we need to recognize a couple of things. One is that we do not have all the answers ourselves. No one institution, no one country, no one discipline certainly has all the answers. So we have to break down some of these barriers between the schools. We have to break down barriers between the university, public sector, local authorities, the private sector. And we have to break down barriers that allow us to start putting together and pulling through some of these ideas so we can shape the public discourse around some of these challenges. And so that's really what I've been really tasked with trying to do within the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. That's what we've been trying to do over the last 4.5 years since I was appointed. And we've really got three strands here. One of which is public policy. So essentially we provide the main interface between the Scottish Government and the entire research sector around climate change and the low carbon transition. In other words, it's not just Edinburgh. We're also acting as a broker for knowledge with other universities as well. Now, in fact, because Edinburgh is such a big university, it's an elephant in the room, often we will come back to Edinburgh but not necessarily. It depends on who has the best knowledge, expertise, and so on. So climate exchange is then a primary way for the Scottish Government to ensure that as it writes its new regulations, its new policies, that it's being informed by the best available evidence, the best evidence around across the piece. There's a huge bit of work on business innovation. Now, some of that is about working with local companies to help develop new products and services. Some of that is about catalysing projects like smart cities to make them happen. And then the other thing we have, which is a step ahead of a lot of people, is we have this magnificent building. So on the top floor, we incubate companies, pre-commercial companies, and we mix them in the same place that we have master's students. So the master's students are listening to the theory while they're here for the year, but they're also mixing with people who are actually actively developing their businesses. And they love it because they're seeing what they're thinking about in the theory being put into practice. In our middle floor, we host different corporates, businesses, social enterprises that are involved in this space. And that's everything from the Royal Bank of Scotland sustainability team have a desk there through to a social enterprise that helps community energy. Because it's about understanding that there is an opportunity of pulling people together. And actually, it's those conversations, not just from the academic down, it's not just a knowledge transfer from us to them. It's about having us around a table and actually shaping and taking those conversations forward. But often, the advantage comes from the conversation in the margin. And the third thing we do is around the skills and learning, so a lot of capacity building work. So we've been doing a lot of work in China, for example, helping support their public policy development through something called the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Committee. We're doing a lot of work here with different groups. And so there's a huge area. And what we're doing is really trying to take master's courses, compress them into short, accessible courses, online, face-to-face courses, which anybody from a business, from a social enterprise, from a government can then access, so they can get access into this knowledge base. And as I said, finally, we have this hub. And what we've tried to do is build essentially a national hub, so that if you want to have a conversation about energy, low carbon, you're going to have it here as much as anywhere else in the country. So we host events and activities. Some we put on ourselves, some other people host here. And we're getting about 1,200 people per month coming through to different events and activities, which could be a company launching a new product or service. It could be a social enterprise, as we had last week, pitching to the community for essentially crowdsourcing, bringing in money from the community to buy a new renewable energy source. So there's a whole range of things that are going on here. And the whole building has been designed to try and encourage, so the ideas at the top, the master's students and the entrepreneurs, the incumbent businesses and social enterprises in the middle floor, and then this whole ground floor being here for events and activities, for teaching, for conferences, and for executive education. And it's been a huge success. We have become, within a couple of years, a national hub. So the question is, what happens next? Well, we think internationally, it's all very well doing well in Scotland. You know, Scotland has taken on really challenging targets. It's going to miss another target next week. But we're actually ahead of the game compared with many in Europe. But actually, the real challenge, if you're interested in influencing things globally, is to say, where are the big emitters? It's in China. So we're going to be opening offices in Hong Kong in a couple of months' time to really take this model and start building that model in Hong Kong and southern China. So it's about trying to influence, as I said, to try and shape that conversation going forward. And to me, within the university, I've talked a bit about energy and carbon, but within the university, we have real talent in whether it's about global health, whether it's about data and informatics, whether it's about governance. We have some real talent that we could develop into these types of impact hubs that can be then influential right the way around the world, which is more than just research and it's more than just teaching. It is about making a stamp on the world to say we can make a difference, a positive difference, by having this very open hub-like approach to trying to solve problems. And so just to finish off, from where I sit, I see such an opportunity for the university over the next few years in not just doing research and teaching, but also being a convener. It has a huge power to convene things, whether it's with the local city authorities or whether it's with global players, whether it's corporate or public sector. It's an honest broker. Yeah? It can be seen to take a step because it's very good not to have a corporate back behind you. Yeah? You can be an honest broker in this place. We can support a lot of this, whether it's policy, business innovation, entrepreneurship. Some of that will be coming out of Edinburgh, but some of it is actually just good to have a hub which just attracts people in. Now, we've had businesses have come in here. In fact, a couple of businesses from the States who've wanted to come and set up in Scotland, and they want to be in this hub, so they actually are part of these conversations going on. We obviously need research that's tailored to end users, and we also have a huge opportunity as a university to much better share good practice. None of us, Scotland, UK, whoever, doesn't have all the answers. And one of the experiences we're finding with working in China or working in Latin America is actually some of their solutions are fantastic, and we can bring them straight back and apply them here. And equally, they're interested in what we're doing, and we can take them over there. So that whole notion of how we share things more effectively around the world is key. So I think from the university's perspective, over the next few years, that third pillar, excellence in innovation, we can develop that hugely. To date, it's been very focused on can we commercialize companies, and we're good at that, and we want to continue doing that. But we can actually do a whole much more. And with that, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kerr. Would you like to stay there, and could I invite questions both from the floor and indeed there may be some online? Could I just remind those who ask questions to speak into the microphone, give their name and their degree and year of graduation. So the floor is open.
Alan Brown. Yes, Alan Brown, MBCHB 1963. You mentioned that this superb talk, thank you very much. You mentioned that this is a national hub. You briefly mentioned nuclear power, shale gas. Is there not, without getting too political, yes, is there not a problem with the Scottish government, which has set its face against nuclear energy and is stalling the development of shale gas production?
So how to do this without being political? I think the first thing to say about the electricity system in Scotland, is that it is part of a GB system, yeah? And we are not separate from the rest of the GB system. So we have to be careful about treating it as if we're a separate island that does not have big interconnectors. So what is happening in Scotland, which is a radical growth in renewables, for example, and obviously the shutting down of the coal-fired generation at Kirkensey and Llangannet next year, is part of a wider GB system. So from that perspective, the nuclear question is less of an issue. What the government is doing is trying to extend the lives of Hunterston and Torness, the two nuclear power stations, as long as possible, because they see that actually the next 5 to 10 years, they are needed. Beyond that, their argument would be actually with local energy generation, not just renewables, but local energy generation, you can get to the point where you do not need those nuclear power stations. You still will need a GB system with big interconnectors, which are being built at the moment between the Scottish system and the English and Welsh system, and indeed the Irish system as well. So I think I'm less worried about the nuclear question. You know, they have a particular issue with nuclear. My concern with nuclear is simply the cost. You know, if you're paying a vast amount of money for guaranteeing it for 35 years, that doesn't make much sense to me. So I have a problem with the cost rather than the principle. On shale, they've been very careful in Scotland not to rule it out completely. And the reason for that is INEOS, who run Grangemouth, have got a 15-year deal to bring in American shale gas. And the question is, what happens when that deal runs out? And what INEOS want is to be able to use local gas. And so the Scottish Government are aware of the challenges, and they're very keen to make sure that there is a proper evidence base to ensure that when shale is exploited, it will be exploited safely. And that's the process we're going through at the moment, is to say, can we find and develop the evidence base? And that's certainly something that the University of Edinburgh, with its, in particular in the geosciences, is heavily involved in, because they actually have a lot of the skill sets that are needed to ensure that we have a good, rigorous, analytical base for this. The other thing that's happening in Scotland, which is different from southern England, is that the experience of dealing with wind farms in Scotland, and in particular the need for communities to be much, much more closely engaged in order to allow wind farms to develop. They are trying, or we are trying, and this is something that we do here as well, are trying to apply some of the learning from that into this contentious shale gas issue. So I think there is a sense that we can actually take social science learning, we can take our scientific learning, and actually help to manage that contentious issue in a way that benefits Scotland in the medium term. I can talk more, but just to give you a sense that nuclear I'm less worried about in Scotland. I think the shale gas one, my worry is that we're going down a route where a lack of people with no evidence are making very strong assertions about how dangerous it is, and that's not backed up by the evidence. And the question then is, how do you have a serious conversation with the local communities, who will be those who are most effective, to ensure that they benefit if and when it is exploited?
Thank you. John Clifford, MSc 1990. Thank you very much for your really illuminating exposition. I think it's fantastic this university is so advanced in these matters. There's just one issue which seems to be missing generally from the analysis and the discussion, and it's something where Britain is most certainly not leading, and that is reduction in consumption. Now, if we were to think about reduction in consumption, what that could really mean, it could have impacts for the point raised by Alan Brown. If we think that we are at the moment predicating our work on a certain expansion of need, we could actually begin to look at reduction. And just one point I'd mention, for example, Germany was attacked by the UK for not signing up to a 15% reduction in energy consumption over a certain period of time. I can't remember the details. What the British government didn't realise is that Germany, like Austria and other European countries, have already done all the easy stuff. They're now getting to the difficult stuff. And it was said that the UK hasn't even begun to tackle the easy stuff, which means, therefore, that if we were to actually find a way to reduce consumption, wasteful consumption, I mean, one could even hazard a guess and say 2 years, 50%, I mean, something really quite drastic in a city like Edinburgh, then we might actually find that we could open the way to even better innovation.
Yeah, the answer to that is absolutely. I didn't talk a lot about it, well, I didn't talk at all about it, but it is something that we are very much involved in. And certainly when we talk about sustainable cities or sustainable islands, a lot of the projects that we are involved in, actually it's not just about how do you generate the energy, it's actually how can you reduce the wastage, because we are phenomenally wasteful as a species of our energy. I was involved in the fossil fuel review group, and one of the things we did look at was the losses through the system across the whole supply chain of energy, from when the fuels are dug out of the ground to actually how much useful energy is provided as a service to people. And it's quite an extraordinary set of losses. And it's one of the reasons why one of our recommendations to the university was then to try and not just focus on those who pull stuff out of the ground, but how do we engage with companies throughout that supply chain of energy. So I would absolutely agree that there is a pressing need for that. The way it's being done here in Scotland is a focus much more on local energy systems, so that you actually start to look much more closely at what are the energy needs locally, whether it's mobility, heating, cooling, electricity, and start to understand what can deliver that locally, and efficiency or demand management is a key part of that. So I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
May I just come back very briefly?
Yes.
On this question of reduction in consumption, It's not just about loss and wastage, but unfortunately economists who are obsessed with growth can't bear to think about the notion of reduction. And here we are, surrounded by moon energy, one of the richest of Scotland. And yet we're not even really grappling with that, and we're not actually considering seriously reduction in consumption. And I think, with respect, you didn't really answer that question in your answer.
Okay, let me say from a Scottish perspective then that what Scotland has done, it has a target to reduce total energy demand, that's the entire energy demand within the country, by 12% by 2020. It's at about 9% now. So in other words, we are starting to see total energy demand coming down. And that's driven largely by much, much more efficient housing, so that we're actually using less energy in the first place. So it is actually trying to drive down the amount of energy we require. So, you're smiling. Perhaps we can take this offline.
Okay. The gentleman behind Professor Monroe first. Sorry, we've got one. Sorry, at the back. Yeah.
So who was next?
Yeah, gentleman here. Yeah.
Brian Smith, MA, sometime in the 1960s. I thought it was absolutely superb, so thank you very much indeed. You spoke about work going on in Scotland, our links with the States, our links with China, and you alluded to South America and Latin America. Can you tell me whether we're doing anything in relation to Africa? Because, I mean, within Africa, clearly, there's not a shortage of solar energy, and there's obviously demands for the high energy involved in desalination and things like that. I mean, are we involved in the African subcontinent, or are we simply concerning ourselves with whether there's a reasonable prosperity, such as in China and the States?
We in ECCI are not working in Africa at the moment. I'd like to, and we've been exploring some opportunities both in East Africa and West Africa, but we don't yet. Yes, in time, but not just yet. Certainly within the university, there is a great deal of work on energy systems within different parts of Africa, whether you're talking about some of the issues that are going on in South Africa, where you've got a very ropey grid, and actually there's lots of opportunities for local energy generation, or you're talking about some of the issues in East Africa, around health and access to energy. So there is a great deal of work going on, but we don't ourselves do that work yet.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi, Aaron Fuller, BCom 99. You've touched on this point talking about consumption and efficiency. How are we doing as a species in terms of the change in carbon input to GDP output? And are we seeing a similar sort of trend as you would have seen with bronze and steel? As we develop, we need less of the input unit to produce the economic growth?
Yeah, I mean, both globally and within Scotland, we're certainly seeing more GDP output per carbon emission. So in other words, that trend is in the right direction. It's not as fast as it should be, but it's in the right direction. At a global level, we had a challenge because for years, through what you might just term energy efficiency measures, we were finding that we were producing more per unit of energy and more per unit of carbon until about the year 2000. And then we had a huge dash for coal-fired power generation in Asia. So actually that trend was reversed for about 10 years, and it's now just changing again. So it's going back onto the right track now, but for about 10 years it was going the wrong way. And that was only because there was a big dash for coal-fired generation. What's interesting, though, is the pictures I showed of the air pollution is actually that is the thing that is starting to drive a lot of changes. So a lot of old coal-fired generation in China is just being shut down. You know, they will just, and being China, they will simply go and say, you know, you're going to stop next year. Doesn't matter what sunk costs you've got, you're just going to stop. And they are trying to replace them with much, much more efficient coal-fired generation or renewables or nuclear. So they're in that sense, they're going back onto the right track. But for a few years, it went the wrong way.
Thank you very much. I'm David Houston, a PhD 1976 and MBA 1987. So I can see this question from 2 points of view. But thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I particularly liked the energy trilemma thing. It appealed to my sort of scientific background. And it helps me frame this question, I think, because I don't hear much talked about energy security, which I think is a very important aspect in that triangle. For example, I do remember it's quite a few years ago, a catastrophic set of power cuts in the United States that caused chaos then. Now, of course, we are so dependent on the internet, and of course our hospitals are all geared up with technology and all that kind of thing. The actual consequence of an unplanned power cut is absolutely catastrophic. So could you give me some confidence that this is being looked at scientifically, and there's a way of detecting, for example, if we're anywhere near that cliff edge of energy security?
Okay, so energy security, it's worth saying there are two or three different parts here. One is around, say, access to oil. So when we had the Grangemouth strikes a couple of years ago, there was clearly an issue. There's also an issue about access to gas because we're importers now. But at the moment, you know, that isn't a problem because we've opened up a lot more terminals for gas. The one people mostly think about is electricity. And certainly the power cuts in California were largely because the government capped the output cost but not the input cost, and the business was going bust basically, so they shut down their power stations. So it was actually human-induced, if you like. For the UK, I think the first thing to say is whoever is the energy minister, which is Amber Rudd, who actually is an alumnus of this university, she will lose her job if there's unplanned power cuts. So the first thing that she should have done when she walked into that job a couple of weeks ago was really ask very hard questions about how close we are to not being able to deliver the electricity we need. And this coming winter, we're really quite tight in the UK because a number of coal-fired power stations have closed down for air pollution reasons. They had a choice, but they chose not to put very expensive remedial technology onto their power stations, so they're shutting them instead. And so we're actually going to be quite tight. Now, if you talk to National Grid, they would say, we're going to be fine. But I did hear Ian Marchant, ex-CEO of SSE, a couple of weeks ago, sort of saying, yes, we're about 2 or 3% okay, but then we're reliant on 10% imports from France, for example, from their nuclear power stations. Now, if something happens, it's very cold out there for a few weeks, we're not necessarily going to get all of that. So he was obviously a bit more concerned. I genuinely don't know, but it's certainly something I would be looking at if I were in her shoes at the moment.
Charles Swainson, MBCHB 71. I got into an argument with some folk the other week, well, my son principally. And the criticism was that, okay, so wind power is a good idea and kind of works, and intermittent and all that, but apart from the community kind of schemes that you've seen on the Isle of Egg, for example, which seems to really work at that level, the rest of it could be characterized as simply shifting money from the poor to the rich, because everybody has to pay through their bills, and a lot of poor people have to have electricity. And yet the main beneficiaries are either the large companies who own land or the landowners who own land. So what's the counter-argument to that?
I think that has been one of the big challenges, where you have had renewables which have been inherently higher cost than alternatives. You have seen those with capital or with land taking advantage of that, and there has been a move of money moving from the poor to the rich. What they have tried to do is to add what they call the social cost onto your bill, which actually drives energy efficiency measures in poorer homes. And what they've used that money for, and that's taken from every bill, what they've done, and this is a UK-wide scheme that's been running for many years, is then aim at those homes that are the most vulnerable. So there has been a substantial sum of money spent trying to improve the quality of the housing in the UK. It is still pretty ropey. And one of the challenges that we have within Scotland is we have phenomenal rates of fuel poverty. That is, where somebody in a household has to spend more than 10% of their post-tax income on energy. And we actually have really bad rates of extreme fuel poverty, where it's more than 20%. That is a shocking statistic in a modern country. And so I think there is a huge amount that needs to be done to try and tackle that. which is about improving the quality of housing, but there is always going to be a challenge. What we're finding now, though, is that there is a limit to how much money will be spent on subsidies, called the levy control framework, and we're getting quite close towards that cap. So in other words, you won't be able to put more renewables in unless essentially it can compete directly in the market without subsidy. So we're getting quite close to the point where that works. But overall, if you look at the sort of 10 years of public policy between 2000 and 2010, yeah, there has been a fairly chunky move from poorer people, sort of move of money from poorer people to richer people. It is now being reversed, and certainly in Scotland, they're doing a lot to try and encourage, as I said, community ownership or community access to energy, even where they don't own the land, so that they become equity shareholders within that system. And that is definitely starting to have an impact in certain communities. So I think they are recognising the problem and starting to address it, but it has been a problem, yeah.
If there are no other questions from the floor, can I ask Professor McPherson if there are any online questions?
I'm afraid there are not.
In that event, I wonder if I could ask something. In the course of my 3 years studying law, LLB 1963 to 1966, I do remember, I encountered for the first time a mythical character, the man on the Clapham omnibus.
Yes.
The man on the Clapham omnibus is a man of average intelligence, average income, guaranteed to have moderate and reasonable views on every subject. That, at least, was the perception of the residents of Clapham at the time I studied law. And my question is, what message would you give to the man on the Clapham omnibus as to his own participation in achieving lower carbon usage? And when I ask that question against the background of two things, the first of all is you have talked of national targets and of international cooperation in this area, and it may appear to the man on the Clapham omnibus that this is all something far too remote from him or her, I suppose we have to say nowadays. And the second thing is that there is perhaps a consciousness on the part of this reasonable person that mixed messages have come out over the years, and I think in particular about the use of diesel cars and the move from that. So the short question is, what should the individual on the Clapham omnibus be doing and thinking about this, apart from continuing to use the bus?
And not only that, but a hybrid bus or an electric bus as well. So, I think the message that, and I'm putting my ECCI hat on here, the message that we have when people come through the door of all sorts, community groups, businesses and so on, is we don't talk about climate change. We don't talk about national targets. We don't talk about international negotiations. What you actually start to focus on is how do we make their well-being better? Because most of us want warm houses. Most of us want efficient transport systems. Most of us want access to electricity as and when. And the question then is, how can we innovate? How can we bring ideas through and practical solutions that help them meet that, rather than, because I am, having been around this piece for however many years, we saw people trying to scare people around climate change, saying, look, it's going to be really bad, therefore you must do something 10, 15 years ago. It didn't work. It won't work now. So going back and saying, hey, look, climate change is terrible, even if it is, it just doesn't work. It has to be located in how they live their lives. And so when we talk to communities, when we talk to businesses, for businesses, it's how can we help them develop new, effective products and services. For communities, it's how can we make their well-being, how can we help them live their lives better in terms of the energy use that they're using. So everything is focused actually around how can we support their needs in a way that happens to be low carbon. And so you don't force it on them, you actually show them, and the whole point about innovation, going back to my original point about the space pen, is it's what works for them. Yeah? We're not going to come up with some elegant top-down solution. It is actually what works for local communities. And that's really where we focus. And that's the message we have for the equivalent of the Clapham man, for the people who come in through this building.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'd wish to join with me again in thanking Dr. Kerr for a stimulating and eloquent and really very challenging presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Unless there are any other emailed questions, I think it is at this stage that I can now invite the convener to move the motion for an adjournment.
Thank you, Chancellor Successor. For the purposes of considering matters which may be transmitted to the General Council by the University Court or any other business of a competent nature, that the Business Committee be empowered to act on behalf of the Council and that this meeting be adjourned to a date to be fixed by the Business Committee.
Thank you. And finally, can I invite the chaplain to close the meeting with a benediction?
Reflecting on all that we've heard and discussed this morning, we ask God's blessing upon us that we may go out from here with wisdom and courage and vision, using our gifts wisely to build a just and compassionate world. Amen.